right now we're going to talk about just kind of the basic concepts of niche modeling and species distribution modeling before we get into any specific algorithms. So you notice I'm saying ENM slash SDM here, so environmental or ecological niche modeling versus species distribution modeling. These terms are often used interchangeably, and even though I've sort of published an opinion paper or two on this, that's actually fine. I think most of the time everybody knows what you're talking about when you say one or the other, and I don't think there's, too much value to be gotten out of being too much of an asshole about that. However, I think it is worth keeping in mind that estimating species niches and potential distributions may actually be quite different undertakings. So making good estimates of species' current spatial distributions from presence-only data is actually relatively easy, as long as you've got a decent-sized data set that's sampled relatively well. Estimating species spatial distributions is not too hard at all. However, using that same sort of data to make good estimates, reliable estimates of species responses to a set of environmental gradients is actually quite difficult. And I'm not convinced that we're half as good at it as we like to think we are as a field. And I just want to sort of caution you, as we work through all these sort of tutorials and stuff, I will say some things that sound very pessimistic about species distribution modeling. I think this is kind of it's not uncommon, I think, with people who spend a lot of time thinking about methods, that we mostly end up thinking about the kinds of ways they fail and the things that they don't do correctly. And that's certainly true of me. I want to be clear right up front here. I do think this stuff works well enough to be useful for many of the applications that we put it to. I do think we can be much better at it, and I think we are probably doing things badly in ways that we don't recognize or barely recognize right now. So I think this is a very fascinating field. I think the models are potentially very, very useful. And when you hear me saying things that sound very negative about them, I don't want that to be overinterpreted as me saying this is all bullshit or anything like that. I just wanted to be clear that I think that the skepticism here has to be there. It's healthy. It makes us better. And I would encourage you all to be skeptical as well and think very hard about what these models are doing and what they aren't doing and how that might affect your specific applications. Okay. That out of the way. What do I mean when I say making good estimates of species environmental tolerances from presence-only data is very hard? Any sort of modeling can be quite difficult, but we have some fairly unique challenges here that mostly boil down to the fact that our data is kind of problematic for what we want to use it for. So let's say we want to estimate a species response to a set of environmental gradients. So here we have two environmental gradients, PC1, PC2. And we have a species, be this little frog dude here. And we want to know how this species responds to this sort of environmental gradient. So these colors here represent, within the boundaries of this environment space, this species niche. So this is a simulation. So, the brighter colors here represent combinations of these two environmental variables that our species likes. So over here, these bright colors, these are the combinations of environments, temperature, precipitation, where it's happy. Darker colors represent combinations of those environments where it's not happy, right? And then we've got sort of intermediate habitat here, etc. So this is that species niche in this environment space. And this is, for many applications, what we want to know. So we want to take our presence data and we want to estimate this thing. We would like to know this as perfectly as possible. This is our goal for many applications, not for all applications. So why is this so hard? Well, first off, our species doesn't live in environment space, right? This is the space of all possible environments within a set of bounds. That's not where our species lives. This little guy lives in Australia, actually. I mean, it's simulated. I made it up, but I'm simulating that it lives in Australia. And that already presents just a huge problem for modeling. This isn't specific to Australia. So you think about this, everywhere you could possibly be in Australia, there's a temperature, there's a precipitation, there's a seasonality, all that sort of stuff. And so every grid cell here in Australia maps to some grid cell here in this environment space. Anywhere you could be in Australia would be in this environment space somewhere, because actually the boundaries of this environment space are set to the minima and maxima of these variables for Australia. So everywhere in Australia is somewhere in this space. However, the opposite is not true. You can have combinations of environments, say these here. Maybe our species likes them, maybe it doesn't, but maybe there's nowhere in Australia that meets this combination of temperature and precipitation and seasonality and all that, right? So Australia maps entirely into this space, but this space doesn't necessarily map entirely into Australia. And so what if we actually look at just which combinations of those two variables are available somewhere in Australia right now? Well, in that case, our actual available environment space in Australia looks like this. So now all these white areas, these are combinations of those two variables that don't exist anywhere in Australia. And this is an interesting problem. It's one we don't deal with particularly well, and it's really kind of subtle, the ways that it actually creeps into our models and screws things up for us. So let's think about this. Okay, so there are these are the combinations of environments that will exist somewhere in Australia, right? What about this space over here? If you remember what that species niche looks like, these are actually combinations of environments that are really good for it. However, there's nowhere in Australia that looks like that. So our species likes a kind of habitat that it has no access to. It's not that it's dispersal limited, it's reality limited. There is no place that meets this set of conditions our species really likes, and likewise up here. And so we could sample every grid cell in Australia. We could sample every individual of our species. We will never get any data, no occurrence points from this area of environment space. No occurrence points from this area of environment space, even though our species likes them a lot. So that means our data, our presences are already biased. But the really interesting thing here, or the other really interesting thing here, is our background data, or our absences. Even if you get true absences, those are biased too. Because let's take, this combination of environmental conditions over here. Our species doesn't like them. If there was somewhere like this in Australia, our species wouldn't live there, and we would sample absence data from here. But there is no there for them not to be in. There is no place where we can go and sample this set of environmental conditions and say, okay, we've got this set of environmental conditions where we never see our species. There's nowhere to sample that, or here, or even, up here. So we've got biased occurrence data because of the availability of habitat in Australia, but we've also got biased absence, pseudo-absence, or background data. Our models don't know anything about whether this kind of habitat is good or bad. So we can't really say much that's useful there. But that's just the start of our problems, right? Because this is assuming these are the environments to be available to our species if it could actually disperse all the way across Australia. But it's a little frog, right? It's not going to do that. It has a range that can be set by, biotic interactions, historical biogeography, those sorts of things. And so it's actually restricted to a small subset of Australia that it can disperse to, which means even those habitats that are available in Australia, it only sees a small chunk of those. So this is the environment space that our little species actually has accessible to it, right? These are the good habitats that it can choose to live in, and these are the bad ones that it can choose not to live in, or it could go there and die because it's extinct population or whatever. So think about this. If we wanted to make a prediction across the environment space that spans Australia, we want our model to make informative predictions across this entire space, and we're starting with this tiny little subset, maybe about 10% of the combinations of environmental conditions that we want our model to be informative on are actually available to us as presence or background data, assuming we choose an appropriate study area. And then on top of that, we've got spatial sampling bias. So we tend to sample a whole lot around universities and big population centers. We sample near roads, we sample near water, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're not sampling uniformly across Australia. We're sampling, in particular, mostly the places where people live and where biologists like to go because they're cool, like up here in the the top end. Yeah. So that means even within that subset of environments that our species can access, we're sampling them often out of proportion to how suitable the habitat actually is. And so our data comes out to be this biased subset of a biased subset of a biased subset of that environment space that we would like our model to be fit across, right? And so we're trying to go from data that looks like this to a model that looks like that. And it's going to be hard, possibly impossible. So this is the real challenge here. It's not, we need a cool new method and everything will be sorted out or anything like that. There are fundamental limitations built into our data based on the kind of data it is and the kind of predictions we're trying to make with it. And we can get a lot better at this than we are, and I think we should, but there are still going to be hard and fast limits to how good we can get at this stuff with the sorts of data that we typically have access to put into it. So, yeah, all that is to say, this is something we should be careful about when we do it. We should think very hard about it, and we should be clear on what our modeling goals are, and use that to drive our methodological choices. And I think that's a really big point that I think is kind of underestimated. I think we have in this field a kind of default approach to everything. We're going to use these kinds of predictors, we're going to use this kind of modeling algorithm, we're going to use this kind of model evaluation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have this kind of one-size-fits-all set of recommendations that everyone kind of likes for modeling, and I think that's probably not ideal. I want to, hopefully, over the course of these videos, actually give you not everything, not every tool that's out there or anything like that, but at the very least, give you some idea of the kinds of choices you might want to be making when you build these models. Hopefully enough information to help you guide you in a direction of making good choices there, but also, just point out there are a lot of these choices that we don't actually have hard and fast guidelines for, and we really ought to be exploring the impacts of those choices, stuff like that. So what you want your model to do is actually the first question you should ask. Are you just trying to predict where your species currently could live? Are you trying to predict to a future time scenario or a different place, or maybe predict into the past or whatever? And actually what you want to actually use your model for, and even whether you want to get a presence-absence prediction or a true probability of occurrence or whatever, what you want to actually get out of that model actually probably should guide how you select your predictor variables, which algorithms you choose, the methods you use to evaluate your models, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because, as I said, we currently have kind of a one-size-fits-all approach, but really the optimal choices for each of these kinds of things is probably going to differ depending on what you want your model to do. Okay, so this was not intended to be like an overall introduction to species distribution modeling or niche modeling. Hopefully, if you're looking at this, you at least have some idea of what that stuff is. This is just kind of giving you a general overview of I think, the sources of the issues we have with modeling, and hopefully get you thinking about the disconnect between what your data looks like and what you want your model to be able to do. All right, and with that, we're going to move on to specific algorithms next.